Yes, here we go. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the Estes Valley Land Trust's May virtual breakfast. The focus of our breakfast this morning is on bison. And we're not talking about reintroducing bison to the Estes Valley. You probably all know that, bison were widespread across the United States. Of course, there were bison in the Estes Valley. I think there's some bones at the museum. We've read about areas in Rocky Mountain National Park where there are bison jumps that Native Americans used to harvest bison. So there used to be bison here a long time ago, but there aren't any more today, of course. But reintroduction efforts are occurring elsewhere in Colorado. We know about a reintroduction effort that's occurring in Larimer County, but also near Lamar. And so we're really lucky this morning to have the executive director of the Southern Plains Land Trust, Dr. Henry Pollock, present about some of the reintroduction efforts there. Henry is a relatively new executive director for the Southern Plains Land Trust. He's been there since October, but prior to that position, he was an academic. He's a researcher. He got his PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His PhD is in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology. One of the neat things about Henry is that he spent 2 years in Guam. So he's a big birder, and I bet I'm sure every presentation he gives, he's going to invoke some birds into it. So you'll probably hear a little bit about birds today too. But he studied a special bird in Guam called the Micronesian starling. And Guam is a very unfortunate but very well-known example of the impact of invasive species. So there's a snake called the brown tree snake that has essentially decimated the bird population in Guam. And so we spent 2 years studying birds and the brown tree snake, and now he lives on the plains of Colorado, a very different environment. So I'm really excited to introduce Henry to our membership.
All right. Well, thanks, Jeffrey, for the introduction. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Nice to be with you. I hope you're enjoying those cinnamon rolls. I must admit, I was a little jealous because I am in Lamar, so I did not get a cinnamon roll, unfortunately. But I am excited to be here today to discuss with you our national mammal, the American bison. So let me share my screen really quickly, and we'll jump right into it. All righty. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. So today, let's go back a little bit. So welcome to my talk this morning. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to be talking about the return of bison to the prairies of North America. And specifically, we'll talk a little bit about Colorado shortgrass prairie in particular. As Jeffrey mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Southern Plains Land Trust. We're based out of Lamar. We're a very different kind of land trust than the Estes Valley Land Trust, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But I do really appreciate the invitation to come speak to you this morning about one of my passions, which is conservation, and the conservation in particular of the American bison, which is our national mammal. So today what we're going to talk about is we're going to start with a crash course on grasslands. We'll talk a little bit about the ecology of grasslands, how they work. Then we'll get into bison in particular, and we'll talk about where bison came from, a little bit about their evolutionary history. Then we will discuss the decline or the destruction of the American bison in the 1800s. We'll talk about the ecological and cultural importance of bison and why there are so many efforts underway currently to try to restore our national mammal to its former glory. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about bison conservation at the Southern Plains Land Trust. So first of all, the question that is begged of this talk to start things out is, what is a grassland? And we're all probably familiar with the idea of grassland. A grassland is essentially a habitat that is comprised largely of grasses, which are in the family Poaceae. But grasslands are really, really important ecosystems on a global scale. So this is a global distribution of grasslands you can see here. And you can see this region here in North America, which is a region we're going to be focusing on for the rest of the talk. But grasslands are distributed throughout the world on most of the major land masses. And grasslands actually make up about 20 to 40%, depending on how you're defining grassland. If you're strictly defining it by just grass, it's about 20%. If you include shrublands and savannas, it's about 40%, a substantial proportion of the Earth's surface. And they're responsible for at least a third of all terrestrial carbon storage. So these ecosystems are really important for a variety of reasons, but in particular to try to store carbon to prevent climate change from having increasing impacts on wildlife. And grasslands in North America are comprised of three kinds of ecoregions. And this might be a review for some of you, but I'll run quickly through it for those who aren't familiar. It starts in tallgrass prairie in the east, and as you go farther west, and a lot of this is actually driven by patterns of precipitation. So as you come farther west, it gets drier, and you go to mixed grass prairie, kind of in the middle there, and then that yellow segment in the west, which is where we're based in southeastern Colorado, is shortgrass prairie. So again, the height of this prairie is dictated by moisture. Where there's more precipitation or moisture out east, you're going to have taller grasses, and as you get drier and more arid out west, the grasses will become shorter. Grasslands are a fascinating ecosystem. As many of you might know, grasslands are often thought of as sort of the tip of the iceberg. So this is a really nice figure that I like to show in my talks. It kind of shows how when you look out at a grassland, and I'm looking out one at my window right now, you see only the tip of the iceberg. You see these kind of the stalks of the grass, but what's really going on in the grassland, what's really important in grasslands is all this underground root systems, right? So because these areas are so dry, a lot of these roots are to store water and to be able to tolerate times of drought. And again, grasslands are only the tip of the iceberg when you're thinking about what's going on in this ecosystem. In addition to carbon storage, as I mentioned in the previous slide, grasslands are also important for a variety of other reasons. These really deep root systems create a sort of natural water filtration system that purifies water and removes contaminants as it sinks down through the water table. Nutrient cycling is another really important thing. So, the cycles of nutrient composition in grasslands is a really important part of ecosystem functioning. And then, of course, and one of the things that we're going to be focusing on for the rest of the talk today is habitat for biodiversity. So in addition to the bison, there's a variety of other species that specialize on grasslands. And we're going to talk about some of that here coming up in a little bit. So now I'd like to pose a question to those of you in the audience. And what I'd like to ask you is, imagine this picture of the globe spinning on its axis. And imagine that if you could point your finger and pick one spot on the earth, you could immediately zoom in there. And I want to ask you folks, what comes to mind when you think of the ecosystems, the terrestrial or land ecosystems around the world that are most teeming with biomass, that have the greatest animal migrations, that have the richest big predator communities? What comes to mind? And feel free to just shout it out or dump it in the chat. I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Wetlands.
Any ideas? Wetlands, okay. I see grasslands. Joy says grasslands. We have wetlands. Any other guesses? Where do the most prodigious animal migrations occur on Earth? All right, I'm going to stick with Joy's answer. And the answer that I was thinking, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Africa.
Yes. Africa, that's correct. So when I think of these sort of landscapes teeming with diversity, I think of the Serengeti of Africa. You have these massive grasslands with all different types of ungulates, zebras, wildebeests, and you also have these massive, communities of large predators, lions, leopards, cheetahs, etc. So I think of Africa, but the really interesting thing, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is the American Serengeti, as I like to call it, or the plains of North America. It rivaled Africa in many ways, and in some ways probably beat it out in the not too distant past. But the reason why grasslands come to mind is because grasslands have these massive seas of biomass, all of this grass, and that grass provides a food resource for large grazers. So, some examples in the Americas are the bison, which we're talking about today. There's elephants in Africa, but all of that food then creates this niche where these large grazers that specialize on grasses can kind of proliferate. And then additionally, these large grazers provide the food base for large predators. So wolves are a great example in North America, lions in Africa, the list goes on. And so, grazing and grasslands and this type of ecosystem across the world has been known to select for these massive amounts of biomass, these huge amounts of large grazers, and then in turn, all of the other aspects of the system that kind of hinge upon those grazers, such as large predators, for example. Now, in North America, as I mentioned, this used to be a sort of American Serengeti. And so if you go back even 10, 15, 20,000 years, you see that this continent used to be dominated by large grazers. These were animals that were specialized on grasslands. These include species like the mammoth, mastodon, and ground sloth. This is a famous digital depiction of some of the wildlife that used to inhabit Yellowstone National Park. And you can see here a mastodon, you can see a mammoth, you can see a giant ground sloth. You can see a bison here that I'll talk about in a minute called Bison antiquus, which was almost 50% larger than the current bison that we have in North America. And then there were predators. There were predators like the American cheetah and the North American lion and other things like that. So again, kind of amazing to think about how much this ecosystem has changed in a very short period of time evolutionarily. This is a picture of some of those extinct bison. So bison latifrons, the one on the left, could get up to 4,400 pounds. That's almost twice as heavy as the current bison that we see here on the far right. And all of these species used to share the North American grasslands and kind of specialize on that grazer niche in North America. Now, unfortunately, we don't have most of these species around today, and that's because of these extinctions that were caused during the Pleistocene. So the Pleistocene ended about probably 13,000 years ago. And at that time period, and it's not known fully whether it was caused by humans. There's an idea called the overkill hypothesis, which is that humans hunted out all of these animals when they migrated into North America about 15,000 years ago. It's also thought that climate could play a role. And in reality, it's probably both. But for whatever reason, a lot of these species went extinct. And we were left with this sort of current complement of grazers that we see in North America. So some examples, and for those of you who have traveled down to the prairie, you probably have seen these: American bison, pronghorn, mule deer, elk. These are some of the grazers that were left behind and then proliferated into that sort of vacant niche space that was left open by all of these extinctions of large megafauna that used to inhabit North America. And we're going to be focusing on the bison for the rest of today's talk. So where do bison come from? We're going to get a little bit into the evolutionary history of bison here. And so bison actually are a relatively young taxon evolutionarily. They originated only about 2.5 to 3.5 million years ago. The earliest fossils that were found were from that age, and those were found in Asia, so in India and China. And one of these species, the species Bison priscus, or it's called the steppe bison is its common name, ended up actually crossing the Bering land bridge. So over the last several million years, as sea levels have risen and fallen with different climate cycles, the land bridge has kind of alternatively been either covered and not connected between Asia and North America, or it's been lower sea level and then exposed. And during those periods of exposed sort of land bridge, a lot of species cross between Asia and North America in both directions. So bison originated in Asia. They crossed over to the Americas about 200,000 years ago. And then they very quickly speciated into a variety of other species. So they came into an area where there was a big niche open for this big kind of grazer ecological niche. They ended up speciating from Bison priscus into a variety of species like this Bison latifrons with these enormous horns. And then over here on the far right, and actually the smallest and most modest of the bison, if you can believe that, is Bison, which is the one that we're familiar with today. But again, when these extinctions happened in the late Pleistocene, about 72% of all of these megafauna in North America went extinct. So you lost a huge amount of biomass and a huge amount of diversity. And you were left with kind of what was left. And again, one of those was the bison that currently inhabits our North American Great Plains today. So what happened after the Pleistocene? As I mentioned, after all of these other species went extinct, it left all of this open habitat and niche space for these other species to radiate into. And so you ended up having these amazing herds of the bison that we know today. In fact, at the height of their numbers, bison were estimated to be at anywhere between 30 to 60 million individuals roaming across the Great Plains. That is just a prodigious amount of animals. And because those bison were around and provided a source of meat for predators, you had abundant predators too. So this might be surprising, but at the height of their population and before westward expansion, there was an estimated 500,000 wolves on the plains of North America. There was an estimated 50,000 grizzly bears on the plains of North America. So again, when I, at least, before I took this job and started thinking a lot about prairies, when I think of grizzly bears and wolves, I think of places like, with mountains. I think of them as a montane species. But the crazy thing is that they actually used to be more abundant on the plains. and they were just driven to extinction by human hunting and westward expansion. So, and this also, Jeffrey mentioned, I had to get into prairie dog reference. I'm not going to focus on them, but, prairie dog colonies, which is another big part of what we do at the Southern Plains Land Trust. There was a prairie dog colony documented in the Panhandle of Texas that was 100 miles wide and 250 miles long, with an estimated 400 million prairie dogs in this colony. So again, it was sort of, despite all the loss of this diversity, the ecosystem recovered, and you get these sort of massive, numbers of these species. So then, going to the Civil War, in sort of the arc of bison history, bison had these enormous numbers, but then after the Civil War, the attention started being turned more towards westward expansion, and really the United States kind of went full force into moving people out west. And what resulted, as we all are probably familiar with, was a wholesale destruction of the prairie and its wildlife. So this resulted in the displacement of a lot of Native American tribes, homesteading and sod busting, overgrazing, riparian deforestation, wildlife persecution. This is probably not an exhaustive list, but just sort of a highlights of some of the impacts that we humans had on these precious ecosystems. So on the top, you can see a sod buster there. This is what happened in the Southern Plains, the great turn up and plow up of the plains of North America, which eventually led to the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. You also had this wholesale destruction of wildlife. This photo on the bottom is iconic of this sort of buffalo hunter standing on a mountain of bison skulls. And then on the top, you can see this is just one particular fort where they were processing bison skins. And, you can just see the enormity of the slaughter that took place in our country. And as a result of this slaughter, the entire bison population throughout North America, that includes Canada and the US, was reduced to an estimated of fewer than 500 individuals by the 1880s. So got very close to being a sort of passenger pigeon type situation where you had the complete loss of this formerly tremendously abundant species. But luckily enough, there were a few individuals who kind of who were prescient and saw this happening and ended up working to save the bison population. And I don't have time to talk about that today. I have a little allusion to them later in the talk. That would be a talk in and of itself. But for the interest of time, I want to tell you a little bit more about the ecology of bison. Before we do, though, let's take a look at this 2-minute video. It's very short. It's a nice summary of kind of how bison went from 60 million to less than 1,000 in only 100 years. Take a look.
There may be no single image that better captures the timeless spirit of the Great Plains than this. A herd of bison on the move across the prairie. As many as 60 million of these majestic animals, also known as American buffalo, once blanketed the Great Plains. In fact, their range is believed to have stretched all the way from what's now eastern Washington to western New York State. For Plains Indians, bison have long been sacred creatures, in part because of their remarkable size and impressive strength. But they have also been an important source of sustenance. The hunting prowess of these tribes enabled them to provide a staggering quantity of pelts to the European and American fur traders who arrived on the plains starting in the 1700s. In the 1830s, the American Fur Company shipped 25,000 robes made from bison fur out of the Great Plains each year. By 1848, the great slaughter of the American bison had begun. Over the coming decades, settlers, hunters, and others nearly wiped out this species. In the 1860s, one hunter earned his famous nickname, Buffalo Bill, after claiming to kill more than 4,200 bison at a rate of roughly 8 creatures a day. He was under contract to provide food for workers building the Kansas Pacific Railroad. When trains finally started running across the Great Plains, passengers often stuck their guns out of the windows and fired away on herds of bison as they passed, just for sport. By the end of the century, of the tens of millions of wild bison that covered the plains, only about 1,000 were left.
So me pause that for a second. Sorry about that. So
There may be no
a nice little short video that kind of describes the precipitous decline of bison in the Great Plains. And the video did a good job of kind of highlighting what the reason for that was. You know, the railroads are vessels of destruction. They brought, you know, people through an easy transportation route out west. And with that came all of this destruction. And the sad thing about all this is that a lot of this bison slaughter, they didn't even eat the bison. They just took them for the hides and sometimes the tongue, and they would leave the rest of this, you know, 2,000-pound animal just rotting on the plains. And there's stories of just thousands of bison carcasses just rotting on the plains, just totally unused. So it's, you know, a tremendous ecological tragedy, a tragedy for the Native Americans of our country who depended on, you know, these bison as a source of food sovereignty. And really, it's in my mind, it's kind of a shameful chapter in the history of North America. So moving forward, what happened when these bison dwindled to less than 1,000 individuals? They were replaced by, you know, things that benefit human societies, so crops and cattle. And this is still kind of the dominant land uses that we have in the region, at least in southeastern Colorado today. Now, while these are incredibly important for human needs, they also do have negative impacts on the land. So some of these include habitat loss. You know, the conversion of grassland or rangeland into cropland results in the loss of habitat and then the species that depend on it. Altered hydrology. In order to grow so many crops and to have cattle on the landscape, you need to often radically alter the sort of water situation to make sure there's standing water on the landscape for cattle, irrigation, et cetera. So that, you know, has big implications for you know, human welfare and society as well. And then of course impaired ecological function. So these systems just do not function the same way as the sort of native intact systems did. And so some of you may be thinking, and I just want to get this out there, you know, I have nothing against cattle. I think that, you know, in terms of keeping grasslands intact, cattle are actually really important for that. And I think that, you know, it's not a black and white situation, but there are major differences that I would be remiss if I did not explain to you in the ecology of bison and cattle that impact how they interact with and subsequently impact the landscapes that they graze. And so I kind of want to go through some of these examples that kind of illustrate how bison and cattle differ in their ecology. And there's a famous quote, and this is anecdotal, of course, but you know, it's often said that in a fierce prairie storm, cattle get spooked, turn tail, and run. But buffalo stay together and go into the storm head on, coming out of it faster, stronger, and united. So the many permutations of this have been used over the years, but the general idea is that bison are just a much hardier animal than cattle. Bison evolved in these often highly variable, you know, drought-stricken, you know, extreme environments in like southeastern Colorado, for example. And they're just far better evolved to deal with the vicissitudes of nature than cattle, which are a non-native ungulate that's been introduced to the landscape. So first of all, let's start going through some of these differences. And first of all, one of the big differences is in movement and grazing behavior. So this is from a paper that came out about 11 years ago, and they were looking at time budgets to understand what percentage of their time bison and cattle spent respectively doing different behaviors. And you can see those behaviors here on the left. And what you'll notice here, I just want to highlight two of these different rows. And you can see that grazing, bison spend a much lower proportion of their time grazing, interestingly enough. Cattle spend about 50% of their time grazing. And the reason why is that bison are just much better evolved to eat the grasses that, you know, that they co-evolved with for a couple million years on the prairies of North America. They get more nutrition out of it. And so they need to eat less grass than cattle. They simply are more efficient at producing that grass. In addition, as a result, they spend a lot more of their time you know, kind of moving. They graze and they kind of move around grazing and create this heterogeneous landscape. Cattle often stay put in the same spot. So you can see that, you know, cattle spend about twice as much time sedentary, just kind of sitting in the same spot. And so to sum up, bison graze less and move more. In fact, bison move at a 50 to almost 100% faster rate than cattle. And the size of the patches as a result that bison use are far larger. So on the average of, you know, 11,000 hectares, which is somewhere around like 25,000 acres probably, versus only 48 to 600 hectares, which is closer to like, you know, a couple hundred to 1,000, acres. So bison move around a lot more. They have much larger foraging patches, and as a result, they end up creating this sort of heterogeneous mosaic that actually ends up increasing the diversity of a lot of other species that inhabit these grasslands. Another impact is that bison have really positive effects on plant diversity because of these heterogeneous grazing patterns. So this is from a 2022 paper that came out, and on the x-axis down here, you can see they compared ungrazed pastures to pastures where bison were grazing, to pastures where cattle were grazing. And what you see is that when pastures are ungrazed, the dominant grass ends up dominating most of the grasses that are in that pasture. So you can see it ends up being sort of what's called a monodominant pasture, with one specific dominant grass species kind of being most of the grass biomass in that pasture. What do you see with bison? You see there's way less dominant grass cover. So bison, because they graze selectively on certain plants and they also graze heterogeneously, they create a much more diverse patchwork of grasses. And you can see that cattle are kind of intermediate here, but bison are clearly better at preventing one particular grass from becoming dominant in a given pasture. In addition, bison have really, really high positive impacts on plant diversity. So here you have the same different treatments on the x-axis, and you're looking at just species richness or diversity of native plant species on the y-axis. You can see it's pretty low in ungrazed pastures, probably because, as we saw in panel A, most of that is dominated by a single species. You can see that the bison have much more diversity in their pastures because of this heterogeneous grazing pattern. And cattle, again, are kind of intermediate between ungrazed and bison. And then lastly, what you see here is that in all of these situations, as you get increasing dominance in a particular species of grass, you get decreasing diversity. So it just shows you, again, that reintroducing bison to areas more than doubles plant diversity. It increases plant diversity more than double the effect of what you see in cattle pastures. And it just shows why these bison are so perfectly adapted to, creating these diverse and healthy grasslands, basically. Third of all, and this you might be familiar with if you've ever seen any videos of bison. Bison make an impact on their ecosystem. In addition to their grazing, they do other stuff too. So this is a series I like to call Bison Rubbing on Insert Object Here. Here's a bison rubbing on a tree. These are bison rocks. In fact, there are certain bison rubbing stones that like dozens of bison will use because it's just really good for scratching. Here's a bison rubbing on a sign in Yellowstone Park. I could include more photos, but this rubbing actually is really important for maintaining grassland habitat. I mentioned earlier that grasslands are maintained by two main factors. They're maintained by fire, and they're also maintained by, by grazing and by these sort of ecosystem engineers like bison, which actually prevent the encroachment of trees because they will either trample them or they'll scratch on them and eventually kill them when they're really small. So bison, interestingly enough, are really important in maintaining these open grasslands. And they kind of are their own ecosystem engineers, keeping that grassland habitat prevalent. Another thing that bison do is they like to wallow. So here's a video of a bison having a nice little wallow. And it might seem like this wallow is bad for the grassland. If you've ever seen a bison wallow, you see they create these big bare patches of dirt. But again, if you think about a grassland, this is actually a little patch of heterogeneous habitat in a sea of grass. And so you get, this is an example of a bison wallow from the late 1800s. You can see they all roll around in this and they create these little depressions. These bison wallows can become hot spots for aquatic species. So when it rains, these bison wallows actually often fill up with water. And you see a great example of that here. And you see all of these aquatic plants coming in. And if you look in the background of this photo, it's grassland back there. So you only see these kind of shrubs and aquatic plants specifically where the bison have created this wallow. So another great example of how bison are kind of engineering their own ecosystem and increasing diversity by creating this sort of heterogeneity in habitat. Okay, lastly, one of the most important things that bison do different from cattle is they're way less dependent on water. And so this is from a paper that I showed you earlier. This is a different graph showing how the time spent at water is influenced by the temperature. And so what you see here is as it gets hotter, or as you move to the right on the x-axis, you're getting hotter temperatures. And what you see here is that both bison and cattle increase their time spent at water when it gets hotter. The cattle are all the way up here, and you can see that they're way, way more dependent on water than bison. And the same thing is shown in this other graph. So this is the probability of habitat use based on distance to water. And what you'll see is bison have this kind of long trailing off slope. So what this shows is that although bison do like water and depend on water, they actually, can move much farther away from water sources, whereas cattle are often parked on streams because they need that water. And you can see here, after even a couple kilometers, the amount of cattle that are away from water drops to zero because they're so heavily dependent on water. And so another interesting thing is that there's been studies of stable isotopes done where they actually take a sample of a bison patty basically, and they can actually test the water in it and understand where that water came from. And what they've shown in those studies is that most water that bison consume comes from rainfall fed sources like the wallows they create or puddles, or from their diet, from the forage that they're eating, as opposed to from streams. Now, if any of you have ever been on a cow pasture or been on a ranch, I am sure you've seen cows, and I'm sure you have seen them parked next to water. And when you go to the streams here on Heartland, which is where I live, they are just battered by cows. There's no regeneration of habitat becoming because the cows will just trample all the regenerating vegetation of cottonwoods, willows. They have a huge negative impact on those riparian areas in particular. Cattle do. And it's very different from bison. And another great example of this is because cattle are so dependent on water. What you see here on the left is a map of Heartland Ranch, which is our biggest preserved split, Southern Plains Land Trust. And you can see all these dots represent either stock dams or stock tanks. So these are artificial sources of water that have either been put there in big tanks, or dams have been created and ditches dug to create these stock ponds like you see here on the right. And these stock ponds are ecological deserts. And you can just see in this photo, they're completely devoid of vegetation. They're bare ground. They're stomped clean. Nothing can grow there. And these are often placed far up on stream drainages at the headwaters and prevent that water from getting farther down in the stream drainages. So what that means is that vegetation can't grow back. You can't get the recovery of these riparian systems. Your streams get increasingly incised. It's this kind of negative feedback cycle that's created by this presence of cattle, the need for water, the intense overgrazing that's occurred over the past 150 years, et cetera. So another great example of how cattle can have negative impacts on water in particular. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention, and this is another thing that would probably take up an entire talk's worth of time, but I should also mention that in addition to the ecological impacts that bison have on the landscape and the positive effects they have on biodiversity and grassland heterogeneity, they're also incredibly important from a cultural perspective. So this is a graph just of a couple different examples of reservations, most of which are in Montana here, one's in South Dakota. But bison are starting to make a comeback. And in particular, they're starting to do that through a lot of these tribes who are reintroducing bison to their indigenous lands. And it's incredibly important for food sovereignty and a variety of other reasons. So this is a really nice Venn diagram that kind of covers how both from an ecological and a cultural perspective, bison are just incredibly important as a keystone species. So I mentioned only some of the ecological things, but bison also contribute to seed dispersal. They also contribute to competition and facilitation. They're incredibly important for tribes in terms of food sovereignty and harvest, for religious reasons, economic benefits, et cetera. So, just something to think about. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in my final slide. So I don't have time to go through how bison have recovered since their precipitous decline in the late 1800s. There were a lot of people who were important in these efforts. These are a few examples, including our former president, Teddy Roosevelt, the Goodnights, George Bird Grinnell, a famous ecologist. This kind of ragtag group of people realized that bison were at the brink of extinction. And in the late 1800s, they made these concerted efforts to bring bison back. And that culminated in the foundation of the American Bison Society, which was founded in the early 1900s. And so, again, this could take up an entire talk, but if you're interested in learning more about this, feel free to reach out to me. And I have some really good references I could give to you about kind of the history of the recovery of bison. But I'll quickly jump forward to the current state of bison in North America. So this is a snapshot from this website here. There's a link at the bottom if you want to explore it. It's very cool. It's through the Defenders of Wildlife, and they've put together this kind of ongoing updated map of different conservation herds of bison throughout North America. So what do I mean when I say conservation herd? What I mean is that bison are managed for conservation and not for meat production. So just a couple stats about bison. You can see there's quite a few bison herds that have popped up around the American West. The overall population of bison throughout North America is about 500,000 individuals. So again, it's a small fraction of what they used to be. There are 60 conservation herds throughout North America. We're only seeing a smattering of those here. But only 20,000 of that overall 500,000 population are in conservation herds and are not managed more for meat, similar to the way that cattle are managed in production operations. So, you know, the recovery is underway, but it's slow, and there are a lot of challenges facing recovery, and it's still going pretty slow. However, in Colorado has a couple really, really good sites that are growing and that host reintroduced bison. One of those was alluded to at the beginning of this talk. That's the Laramie Foothills herd. That's up around Fort Collins. There's the Rocky Mountain Arsenal herd. And then, of course, and my favorite, although I might be biased personally, is us, the Southern Plains Land Trust. We're based in southeastern Colorado. So there's a couple herds. There are also some production herds that are relatively large, and some of them are managed kind of in a hybrid way. So, you know, they're not terrible, but, you know, we have a lot more work to do to get back to, you know, where bison are restored to their former glory. And I put this link in here. If you're interested in learning more about bison reintroduction efforts, this Colorado Encyclopedia article has a really good link that discusses some of those other bison reintroduction locations. So just to kind of summarize the talk, bison are incredibly important for grasslands. Grazers in general are incredibly important for grasslands throughout the world. They help maintain those habitats, and they're really important for the grassland systems. But bison still occupy less than 1% of their former geographic range, and their population remains at less than 0.1% of their former numbers. So there's a long way to go in terms of conservation. And I think what we need, just to kind of sum up, you might be saying, well, what can we do? I think what we need is we need large nature preserves. And that's one of the things that we're working on at Southern Plains Land Trust. We have on Heartland here 43,000 acres, so it's growing, and it's going to keep getting bigger. And the more land we have, the more bison we can support. Simple as that. We also need increased connectivity between preserves. Bison historically migrated tremendously large distances. They would come through an area and disappear and come back a couple years later sometimes. So, you know, we need to facilitate these natural large-scale movements for the health of grasslands and for the health of the bison species. And there are efforts going on to do this. American Prairie in Montana is a great example. They are working to put together a 3 million acre preserve that combines Bureau of Land Management lands with privately owned preserves to create this kind of massive bison refuge. And I hope that we can move towards that in the Southern Plains, although we're a little bit farther behind them right now. And then, of course, we need more bison in conservation herds managed for conservation and not just for meat. And we also need to empower tribes with more land and space to be able to have bison herds. So these are a couple of the different things that I think are, you know, ways forward to keep enhancing bison conservation and bringing these species back to their former glory. So really quickly, I had to give a quick plug about the Southern Plains Land Trust, which is where I work. We were founded in 1998. Our founder was Dr. Nicole Rosamarino. Nicole is still on our board, and she now serves the governor of Colorado as his wildlife advisor. So she's doing big things at the state level now, but she's still definitely involved in Split. And she founded this with some other grad students from CU Boulder. And their mission, you know, in response to, you know, the continuing loss of habitat and degradation of grassland habitat, was to create a network of prairie preserves that would protect wildlife in perpetuity across the Southern Plains. So right now we're based in southeastern Colorado, as I mentioned, and we have 3 preserves that we own in fee. And we also protect a couple of different properties in easement as well. But we have Heartland Ranch, which is where I live, which is right here, Raven's Nest, which is about 5,000 acres, and these are both in Bent County. And then here in Baca County in the far southeast of Colorado, this was actually where Split originally started, which was Fresh Tracks. So that was our first preserve. A couple just highlights of what we've achieved in the last 25 years is more than 60,000 acres protected. And a lot of that has occurred in the last 10 years under Nicole's guidance as our former executive director. We also have our own bison herd. So we have 113 individuals. 13 of those are calves that were just born in the past month or two. So if you're ever able to make it down here and want to see some cute bison calves, you're all welcome. And we also do other stuff. So Jeffrey mentioned that we're not just bison. I've focused on bison for this talk, but we really like prairie dogs. We're actually a recovery site for the critically endangered black-footed ferret, one of several in the state of Colorado, and a variety of other things. These are just a few highlights, but this is a great map or a great graph that shows how we've grown in recent years. And again, you can see that we have a very different model than the Estes Valley Land Trust. We actually focus mostly on buying land in fee, and easements are kind of the secondary to that. So very different. But I just quickly wanted to kind of go over some of these differences between our organizations, and talk about how, land trusts, are not a monolith. We do things in a variety of different ways. And I think EVLT and Split exhibit really complementary approaches to land conservation. So I think, one of the differences that I'll highlight is that Split tends to actually be private. So most of our preserves, they are not public access. You have to get permission to come here. And the intention of that is to try to minimize the impact of humans on the land and really provide a refuge for these animals and plants. EVLT is kind of mixed, but you guys also do substantially more public, including several of your easements are publicly accessible, at least at certain times of year. So that's something that I think we, want to consider. But I do think that it's important to have, private conservation as well. We buy land largely in fee, as I mentioned, although we do have a couple of easements, and it's kind of the reverse for EVLT. So that's another difference. And I think in that case, Split is actually the exception. Most land trusts tend to conserve land and easement. We do the opposite. We buy land, and that's kind of been our main strategy. And part of that is because land is just a lot cheaper in southeastern Colorado, as you can imagine. Community-centered. EVLT is very community-centered. This May breakfast is a great example. The soapstone visit coming up, the student environmental film that you guys put on. You guys do a great job of connecting with the local community. And before we got on today, I was just talking with Jeffrey and Joanna about how, I think Split could really improve in this area. And that's something that I hope to bring to the table in my new capacity as executive director. And then lastly, we at Split focus kind of on land acquisition. And we also do a lot of ecological restoration. So after I get off the phone with you guys, I'm going to go out of my house and I'm going to pull some old rusted barbed wire fence that's dangerous for wildlife. At EVLT, it's focused more on easements and monitoring, on community programs. So just a couple examples of how our two land trusts differ, but what we do share is our passion for conservation, our passion for wildlife and outdoors. And I look forward to continuing to work with EVLT. We were just talking about, maybe becoming sister land trust and doing more collaborations like this. So with that, I'll kind of wrap things up and say thank you so much to Jeffrey and Joanna for the invitation. Thank you all for listening. If you're interested in learning more about Split, here's our website. And I'm happy to take any questions, and I'll pass these slides on to Jeffrey in case anyone wants them for their records. So thank you again, and happy to take any questions.
Henry, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. It's, I don't know that I've never been to the Lamar area. I've never been to Heartland Ranch. I'd love to come visit Heartland.
We're going to get you down here for sure.
I'll bring my work gloves. I'm totally willing to help pull some fence. We don't get to do that
Awesome.
very much
Sounds good.
in Estes. And I really appreciate your comparison of the two organizations too. And the fact that you've done some research into the way that EVLT operates. I have a number of questions, so maybe I'll just kind of break the ice. One of the things I think is really interesting about your position is you live on a preserve, and that is very uncommon. There's about 25 land trusts in Colorado, and as Henry said, most of them are like EVLT in that they conserve land through conservation easements. There aren't a lot of preserves, land owned by land trusts. Now that's common on the East Coast. There's a lot of land trusts in the New England area that own land, but most Colorado land trusts don't. So Henry, you get to live amongst bison. I mean, you may walk out your back door today and I don't know if you'll come face to face with a bison, but they're
Oh, they are regularly in the garden, sometimes eating off our bird table. They show up when they pretty often. So
that's amazing.
yeah.
So that prompts so many questions, but I'm interested in the social structure of a herd, and I wonder if just in observing them, are there dominant bison that kind of lead the pack? Are there subtle nonverbal body movements that mean let's
Yeah.
go this way? I mean, how do they communicate?
Yeah, so that's well, that's a whole PhD thesis of answer right there. But I just to sum up, the social structure of bison is generally, and this is similar for a lot of large mammals and ungulates in particular. They'll have generally the females and the young will hang out together in a group, and there will be a dominant male that kind of has like almost a harem, kind of like elk. So there'll be a lot of females around. And then there's a lot of kind of solitary bulls that will kind of, when they hit 1.5 2 years old, they'll get kind of kicked out of the herd, and then they'll just kind of wander themselves and eventually hopefully find their own harem to establish. But yeah, it's bison are famous for their battles, right? That they have these enormous heads, and that the heads of the males are like twice as large as the females, and the reason why is because they battle for supremacy, and they butt their heads together. And if anyone's ever seen a bison rut, or and that actually happens, it's going to happen here in about the next month. It's an incredible sight. You can see it at Yellowstone. There's a few places where you can see it, but generally that's how the social structure works. One thing that I would like to do in my capacity at Split is to do more science and monitoring. And so I think it's really important to know not only what land we have, but what does that mean for the wildlife? How does Bison actually translate to protecting wildlife? What wildlife have we got here? How do they behave? Moving in those directions and Split is something that I'd like to do. Try to understand a little bit more of the intricacies of the social structure, and understand how these groups are kind of mixing and matching. We do have two groups of bison that were kind of in separate parts of the ranch on the north and south, and we recently have allowed them complete connectivity so they can roam almost the entire 43,000 acres, and they have not merged yet. So they've maintained their own separate groups. Yeah.
Do you think they know about each other and they just haven't decided
I don't know.
to commingle?
I'm not sure. But that's why we need more research, and that's something that I'm excited about. And it's I am a little biased. I come from an academic background, so I do value research a lot. But I think it's really important for conservation too. Should I start, or Joanna, do you want to kind of navigate these questions in the chat, or should I just answer them one by one? Or
yeah, I think we can just kind of go down the list. I'm happy to just play my role as a question reader.
Sure.
So the first one is whether you have burrowing owls at the prairies that you manage.
We have lots of burrowing owls. So burrowing owls, as some of you might know, they like to nest in prairie dog burrows. So prairie dogs are, I could talk for a couple years about the importance of prairie dogs. They are incredibly important for grassland ecosystems, and they're hubs of diversity. And so those burrows that they create space for other animals to nest and breed in, including burrowing owls. And if you ever manage to make it down here, if you come during the summer or early fall, you will definitely see burrowing owls. So
that's awesome. So the next one's from one of our board members, Don. So how do you raise money to buy your fee holdings? What are your fundraising strategies over there?
Yes. So I think in Colorado in particular, one of the biggest things that has been a game changer for us, and if you saw that graph where it's like kind of like our land acquisitions really accelerated in recent years, a lot of that has been due to the conservation tax credit. So for those of you who aren't familiar, what this is it essentially is a one-time payment that you will get if you put a conservation easement on your property. So for example, if we buy a ranch out here that's on the market for $5 million, and we say we're going to come in, we're going to put down an easement that prevents commercial grazing, it prevents hunting, it prevents energy development, or like any building, basically, like just preserving the landscape as it should be, in perpetuity without any human influences, that majorly devalues the land, right? That land is no longer going to be worth $5 million because you can't hunt on it, you can't graze it, you can't, so when you do that, you're diminishing the value of the land. But as a result of doing that, there's an incentive in the state of Colorado for conservation, whereby a large chunk of that money that you are devaluing the property from comes back to you in the form of a one-time tax credit. And so that ends up effectively making the cost of land for conservation organizations that want to buy land and fee a lot cheaper. And so that has been the number one thing that has allowed us, and land is really cheap down here, right? Like, I mean, comparatively, it's increasing because green energy development, there's a lot of prospecting. But if you go, I remember I saw a talk recently and they were talking about buying a parcel of like 2 acres, or no, maybe it was like, I think it was something like less than an acre or something really small. And they were like, oh, how much per acre was it? It was up in Denver. And they were like, oh, it was like, I think it was like a quarter of an acre was $200,000. And I was just like, oh my goodness. Like, land around here is about 500 an acre. So, in terms of why we're different from other land trusts, it's because land is cheap here and we're able to buy it. The other ways that we do it are, typical NGO stuff. So we have a really big donor base, and donors contribute a lot of money. We apply for a lot of grants, and we've been really successful at getting grants from places like Great Outdoors Colorado and other big funding agencies for land acquisition. And then another big thing is carbon credits. So grasslands, I mentioned at the beginning, store a ton of carbon. But interestingly enough, grassland carbon markets have lagged substantially behind forest carbon markets, and it's taken longer for them to get regulated and to be monetized. And so as a result, Nicole, who is our founder and former ED, was kind of at the vanguard of monetizing grassland carbon credits, and that's a substantial source of income for us, and it's sustainable, right? So basically what you do is you do an assessment of how much carbon your land can store. And then based on the amount that you're storing, there's like a per ton amount, say $15 per ton of carbon that you're storing. And then you get paid. You can do it in annual, you can do it in like a 5-year bundle, but you get paid this year. We have 7 projects right now that are in carbon, and these are all different parts of Heartland, different parts of different preserves. Not all grassland is allowed to go into carbon. It depends on the soil type and a few other variables. But that this year we'll get 250,000 in like a 1-year payment for all of those different carbon projects. So it's a big amount of money, and the more land that you buy, the more carbon you produce and the more money you can generate. So it's kind of like a snowball, and the more property we acquire, the more we're going to be able to lean on carbon as a source of income. So those are kind of the main categories, I guess. Yeah.
That's so interesting, Henry. And it's funny because that was one of our questions in the chat. So you beat them to it.
Great question.
Yeah. So our member Tim says, I've always loved the romantic idea of the Buffalo Commons. Could you comment on your opinion on that?
Yeah, so Tim, I can tell you've read a little bit, Tim, and the Buffalo Commons is an idea. Tim might know more than I do. I've actually only become familiar with this recently, but it's this idea that there's this large common space of land that is home to a lot of buffalo and could be sustainably managed, to kind of recreate some of that. That kind of the numbers that we used to see and having these really large landscapes. And I think it's a great idea. I mean, do I think it would work in practice? I think it would be tough. I think that oftentimes the idea of having like a communal system, and if you look at, world governments, I mean, it's a great idea, right? But oftentimes putting into practice is challenging. And, there's going to be cheaters in the system. There's going to be people who aren't respecting the commons, which is why you end up sometimes with situations like, as Garrett Hardin described, the tragedy of the commons, where when you have a communal resource, it ends up getting abused by everyone. So I think the idea is romantic. I think it's a good idea. I think implementing it would be really challenging. And I'd be happy to talk with you more about that, Tim, if you're interested in discussing. Yeah.
Thanks, Henry. So Anita asks, and I'm hoping that this is a cute story. Please tell us about the first bison calf that was born on the ranch.
So this was before my time, Anita. I actually just got here. So the bison came in 2015. They've been around for, I guess, almost 9 years now. And it started small and has grown substantially in recent years. And one thing about bison is I mentioned that Into the Storm quote. They're a very hardy animal, and they don't have any native predators anymore. Wolves used to eat, Plains wolf used to eat bison, but there's nothing except for, if they get disease, there's really nothing to limit their population growth. So they're going to keep growing and growing and growing. And eventually we're going to have to keep buying land or find a solution for that. But the first calf was born, I think, soon after they arrived. And in 2015, and I think the cows produce only 1 calf annually. So it's, large animal. The gestation period is also about 9 months. So similar to humans. So a lot of the bison are going to be starting to reproduce in the next month or so. And then they'll have the babies actually in like March and April. So we actually just had a big kind of crop of babies that were produced from last year. Because again, it takes 9 months to gestate. So.
And so we have another question, and then if folks have questions, maybe they want to call out, depending on, I don't know how much time we have left. So how long does it take to return previously grazed or cropped land to shortgrass prairie in the land you manage?
Yeah, so if previously grazed land, it's just a matter of letting it rest. I will say that these systems, and I talked about monodominance and having one overall dominant grass species, these areas have been so heavily grazed for so long that they have changed in their composition. So the grass here is primarily buffalo grass and blue grama, but that makes up probably 95% of the grasses in our grassland. There's a lot of pockets of other grasses, but because they've been so heavily grazed, and buffalo grass and blue grama are the most resistant to grazing. And so those have kind of been able to stick around, and a lot of other stuff has been just grazed so intensely that it's disappeared. So one of the big things is just letting the land rest enough, but that's another reason why bison will create heterogeneity, and they'll create bare patches. They allow for a variety of different grass species to establish, and they just have huge impacts on grassland diversity. So, in terms of that, it's just a matter of letting the land rest, and usually that'll take a couple years, probably maybe and it depends on rainfall. A lot of it depends on rainfall. So if it rains, it'll recover, boom, really quickly. If it doesn't rain and you have a drought, it could take a few years. Cropped land is fundamentally different than grazed land. So if you plow up grassland, and then you try to, you crop it for 20, 30 years, whatever, then you try to put grass back in, it's not going to behave the same as a regular grassland. The loss of that topsoil is a huge loss. And it takes, I don't have a good answer for you on how long that would take, but centuries, millennia, I don't know. But that's one of the big problems with the areas around here that have been, a lot of these areas, the grasslands are not as robust as they used to be, because a lot of them were, plowed up for cropland during the 1920s and 30s and the Dust Bowl times. And so, yeah, it just doesn't, it's not the same. So.
Thanks, Henry. Well, that's all the questions in the chat, and we definitely want to respect your time. It sounds like you have a lot of work to do today. So, Jeffrey,
I'm just going to go pull some fence and dream about those delicious cinnamon rolls that you guys all
we're going to have to get them to you one way or another. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And everybody, lovely to meet you. If you have any questions, reach out. I'll pass along the PowerPoint if you're interested. And yeah, hope to see you at a split event in the future, or maybe at an EVLT event. So.
And Henry, if they wanted to reach out to you, your email is probably available on the Split website.
It is, but I'll type it in the chat right now.
Yeah, any contact information you can put in the chat would be great.
Yeah, split@southernplains.org. Feel free to reach out, and if you want to set up a call or just chat about anything, happy to help. So.
Henry, thank you so much for your time. And I wish I could be down there today with you pulling fence. That sounds like a lot of fun.
We will sometime soon, Jeffrey. And thank you again both for the invitation. And lovely to meet you all, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you, Henry.
And everybody,
Bye-bye.
Stay online, everybody else, if you can. I just wanted to say one last thing. I'm going to try and share my screen. Let me see if I can do this effectively. Yeah, here we go. So this is, we kind of consider Henry's presentation as the first part in a two-part series, and the second part is our tour to Soapstone Prairie Natural Area. You may have seen this published in the paper. I'm sure you saw this via email from Joanna. It's coming up in just a couple of weeks. So we're going to make a special trip to the Soapstone Prairie Natural Area in Red Mountain Open Space. There's a bison pasture there. You may remember seeing Henry's map of these different conservation herds. There's 3 in Colorado. His is at the south. This is at the north. There's one in the Denver area too. So this is a really cool opportunity. We're going to leave at about 9 a.m. on Wednesday, the 22nd. We've got shuttles set up. We've got lunch set up. So everything is taken care of. You just have to be there at 9, hop on a bus, and then we're going to spend a day in here. Look how beautiful this place is. It's absolutely gorgeous. We encourage folks to bring their binoculars. We're going to try and get some scopes. We have 2 presenters. So one of them is Casey Cisneros. He's a stewardship director for Larimer County. He's going to talk about the whole idea of reintroducing purebred bison back to the plains. It's not something you can just do overnight. There's a ton of planning involved. There's coordination with tribal communities. There's major fencing that has to be installed to keep the bison in the right places. There's prairie grass management. This is also historically a cattle ranch. There's even some hunting, some pronghorn hunting and deer and elk hunting that occurs there. There's mountain biking, there's hiking. There's a lot going on here. How do you do all of that and maintain this bison herd? So he's going to talk about that. And then in addition, we have a scientist. She's a reproductive physiologist, and she works, I think, with a veterinary school, but there's a disease that has plagued bison called brucellosis, and she is responsible for looking at embryos. So this is microbiology, looking at embryos and ensuring that those embryos are brucellosis free, so that when the animals grow up and are born and live on the prairie, they're free of brucellosis, which means they're healthier and that their calves are more likely to survive. So anyways, it's a very sciencey presentation, but it's going to be fascinating. So we have a limited number of seats available. You can access more information and sign up online. You can just go to our website, or Joanna, maybe we'll just send out another email today with the link to the registration, and you all can register for that event if you'd like to. We'd love to have you participate in that. That's all I have. Thank you so much for participating in the talk this morning. I thought it was fascinating. If you ever want to go to Heartland Ranch and see the bison, maybe the Land Trust can coordinate a trip. It would have to be an overnight trip. It's about 4.5 hours away, but that's something we would love to talk about. And feel free to take yourself off mute. If there's anything else you'd like to say or any questions you'd like to ask, Joanna, if there's anything you'd like to share, now's the time.
I just dropped that RSVP link in our chat.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just take a minute. You can click on that link and that'll take you right to the registration. All of you are members, so there's a discount rate. This isn't a fundraising event for us. It's just to cover our transportation costs and our lunch costs. I think it's $40 for members. It should be a fun day. I don't see any other questions or other comments, so I'm going to go ahead and
You say that you're going to share the presentation with the audience, or did you, will you share the presentation from Henry?
Yes, we can do that. Yeah, we've asked him for a copy of that presentation, so we'll secure that, and then we can email that link to all of you.
And this recording will go up on our we have a YouTube channel, so the full recording will be available as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us. This is so lovely. Have a wonderful Saturday.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.